Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 2, January to March, 1931.
Events now marched swiftly to their appointed end. Rioting continued in the capital and elsewhere during the 6th and 7th, and as the troops were repeatedly compelled to use their weapons, the tale of casualties mounted steadily. With Japan, as it seemed, on the verge of revolution, her friends and enemies alike waited breathlessly for the denouement. But suddenly the whole complexion of affairs underwent a marked change. Speaking in the Diet on January 10th, the foreign minister announced in solemn tones that a critical situation had arisen in China, the gravity of which was enhanced by the unlooked-for intervention of a third power. Baron Fukuhara then reviewed the negotiations which had taken place with regard to the Sayers concession, reminded his hearers that the Chinese government had lately adopted a tone which was difficult to reconcile with peaceful intentions, and added, "In order to make our position quite clear, we have informed the United States government that, since the question at issue concerns only ourselves and China, we do not propose to make the Sayers concession a subject of diplomatic negotiation with any other power." Appreciating to the full the significance of these words, the deputies gave way to patriotic fervor, their cheers quite drowning for the moment the tumult of the crowd, which still surged about the precincts of the Diet. An hour or so later, when the evening papers appeared with a report of the foreign minister's speech under flaring headlines, and the people read that little Japan had figuratively snapped its fingers under the nose of the American colossus, they speedily verified the premier's prediction by forgetting all about those grievances which they had come out to ventilate. Serried masses of workmen still paraded the streets, but in place of the hymn of revolution, many of them were now chanting the martial songs which their fathers had sung on the eve of battle, and the air was full of banzais. That night the labor chiefs held an emergency meeting, at which they decided to annul the general strike and suspend their campaign against the government until the foreign crisis was at an end. A few of the leaders were against this course, arguing that the crisis had been deliberately manufactured to turn the thoughts of the people away from their wrongs, and that action by the workers was more necessary than ever now that the imperialists were seeking to plunge the country into war. These counsels, however, were not listened to. Not only was the strike declared at an end, but the meeting passed resolutions pledging the trade unions to support the government in any reasonable measures it might take to safeguard the country against foreign aggression. Prince Kawamura's scheme had, so far, proved completely successful. Revolution had been averted for the moment, but unless the fires of patriotism were kept burning, a reaction might set in and the forces of disorder again become supreme. The press was therefore encouraged to inflame racial passion by recalling the American attitude on Japanese immigration. In a few days, a violent anti-American campaign was in full blast. Fuel was added to the blaze by the receipt of a strong note from Washington, which not only upheld the validity of the Sayers concession, but declined to recognize Japan's claims to favored treatment in the district concerned, and expressed profound surprise at the tone of the foreign minister's speech in the Diet. Contrary to all diplomatic precedent, the Japanese government at once communicated the contents of this note to the press, which naturally hailed it as further evidence of America's aggressive intentions. In a further note, dated February 4th, the United States proposed that the dispute over the Sayers concession be submitted to arbitration, as provided for in the Nine-Power Treaty negotiated at Washington in February 1922. Japan, however, declined the proposal on the ground that the question at issue concerned her sovereign rights and was therefore not a fit subject for submission to an international tribunal. Undeterred by this rebuff, the United States government was continuing its efforts to promote an amicable solution when an incident occurred which gave a fresh impetus to the war fever in Japan. On February 15th, a New York paper stated, with an air of authority, that all American warships in the Atlantic had received urgent orders to pass through the Panama Canal and join up with the Pacific Fleet at Hawaii, from whence the combined force would make a cruise to the Philippines. This report was instantly contradicted by the Navy Department in an official communiqué. A few ships, it was stated, had certainly been ordered to the Pacific, but only in line with ordinary routine, and the report of a naval cruise to the Philippines was absolutely unfounded. But the mischief was done. The original message had been flashed to Japan, where it caused the wildest excitement, while for some reason, never satisfactorily explained, the Navy Department's denial was held up for several days. Before it reached Tokyo, or at any rate before its receipt was officially admitted there, the government addressed a sharp note to Washington, protesting against naval movements which could only be interpreted as a menace to Japan. The note went on to declare that American transports were known to be under orders to proceed to the Philippines with cargoes of guns and naval mines, and added that unless these ships were immediately recalled, the imperial government will be forced to conclude that the intentions of the United States government are not of a friendly character. It was now clear to all that Japan was bent, if not on provoking war, at least on subjecting the United States to a diplomatic humiliation that would not only reduce American prestige in the Far East to zero, but at the same time force that country to acknowledge, in so many words, Japan's complete ascendancy in China and her monopoly of Chinese resources. The gravity of the issue was fully appreciated at Washington, but the authorities were determined to prevent the catastrophe of war, if this were possible, without the sacrifice of national honor. In a long and courteously worded note, the Japanese government was urged to reconsider the arbitration proposal and assured that the United States would scrupulously refrain from taking any action, military or otherwise, that could in any way be construed as prejudicial to Japanese interests. The Sayers Concession, as well as all other American undertakings in the disputed Chinese territory, would be regarded as in abeyance pending the decision of the arbitration court. The note concluded by recalling the traditional friendship between the two nations, which the United States government most earnestly desires shall continue unimpaired, and which it will do its utmost to preserve. But forces were already at work against which all the arts of diplomacy were powerless. Japan, having definitely resolved to unsheathe the sword, was in no mood to draw back at the 11th hour. Her reply to the last American note was curt, and while professing peaceful sentiments, reiterated the demand that no reinforcements of any kind, whether of ships, troops, or material, should be dispatched to the American stations west of Hawaii. The imperial government, added Baron Fukuhara, assumes that the transports already en route to Manila will be ordered back immediately, failing which, it must reserve the right to take such measures as may be expedient in the interest of national defense. There were some members of the cabinet at Washington who would have yielded to this ultimatum, for such in effect it was, rather than involve their country in war, but by this time public opinion was taking a hand in the matter. Devotion to peace is inherent in the American temperament, but so also is a passionate patriotism, which at moments of national crisis is apt to override every other consideration. If in this instance the Japanese demands had contained the smallest element of justice or equity, had they even been presented in a less bellicose manner, public opinion in the United States would have been unconquerably opposed to war, and the government might have made almost any sacrifice of interests in the Far East without incurring the anger of its people. As it was, however, Japan's truculence had the desired effect. The State Department's last note to Tokyo was condemned in nearly all quarters as being far too mildly worded, the press, with few exceptions, urging the government to inform Japan in plain terms that the limit of American patience had been reached. More than this, it demanded that all requisite steps be taken without delay to protect American interests in Asia. Special emphasis was laid on the necessity of putting the Philippines into a state of defense. Confronted with this evidence of the nation's resolve to defend its rights at all costs, the government had no option but to adopt a stiffer attitude towards Japan. This it did by notifying Tokyo that the latter's demand for the recall of the transports en route to Manila could not be entertained. At this date, February 28th, the ships in question, Beaufort and Newport News, were halfway across the Pacific, and destroyers of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet had been ordered to meet them at a point 1,000 miles east of Manila to convoy them safely over the last stage of their journey. Concurrently with this note to Japan, Admiral Ribley, commanding the Asiatic Fleet, was instructed to assemble all units of his command at Cavite, the principal naval base in the Philippines, there to await further orders. The political situation, he was informed, was serious enough to justify the taking of special measures for the safety of his command. Not until long afterwards was it known that the issue of these orders to Admiral Ribley had occasioned a serious dispute at the Navy Department and led to the retirement of Captain Appleton, the Assistant Chief of Naval Operations, an officer of brilliant attainments, whose appointment to this important post a year earlier had evoked some heartburnings, it being usually held by a flag officer. The Asiatic Fleet was less of a fighting organization than a squadron for showing the flag. Excepting the destroyers and submarines, it was composed of obsolete ships with limited military value. Besides the flagship Missoula, an armored cruiser more than 20 years old, it comprised the Frederick, an older and smaller vessel of the same type, 3 slow and ancient light cruisers, Galveston, Denver, and Cleveland, the small airplane carrier Curtis, 10 destroyers, 3 light mine layers, 12 submarines, and various non-combatant auxiliaries. As the larger ships of this squadron could offer no serious resistance in case of attack by the Japanese fleet, and must inevitably be destroyed if they were brought to action, Captain Appleton urged their immediate recall to Hawaii. The destroyers and submarines he proposed to leave in the Western Pacific, as they were well fitted to cooperate in the defense of the Philippines. But this plan did not commend itself to Admiral Morrison, the Chief of Naval Operations, who rated the military power of the Asiatic Fleet more highly than his subordinate, and believed that, if concentrated, it could put up a good fight against anything short of the Japanese battle fleet. Declining to accept responsibility for orders which he regarded as the forerunner of certain disaster, Captain Appleton resigned his post and applied for a sea command. This, however, he did not receive till some time after, when events had fully vindicated the accuracy of his judgment. His successor as Assistant Chief of Operations was Rear Admiral Hubbard. On March 2nd, a message was received from Admiral Ribley acknowledging the department's orders, but requesting the prompt dispatch of reinforcements for his fleet and indicating deficiencies in reserve ammunition and other warlike stores. This proved to be the last communication from him. A day later, the cable ceased to work, and repeated radio messages, both direct from the high-power stations on the West Coast and relayed from Samoa, failed to elicit an answer. Nor could contact be made with Guam, though in normal circumstances, the radio plant at that island could send over a distance of 10,000 miles. From the silence that now descended on the Western Pacific, it was only too plain that some radio installation of maximum power was being used to jam all signals from the American stations, nor could there be any doubt as to who was responsible for this interference. The only conclusion possible was that Japan had cast her vote for war and was already engaged in acts of hostility. This belief was universally held at Washington on the evening of March 3rd. But it was not until March 5th that the Japanese ambassador, Count Sakatani, applied for his passports, and by that time things had happened which made the Japanese declaration of war a somewhat superfluous formality. Late in February, when the gravity of the situation could no longer be ignored, the majority of the warships then in the Atlantic and Caribbean had been ordered to join the flag of the Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific, Admiral Robert J. Dallinger. Needless to say, these orders were not made public, but the volume of naval traffic through the Panama Canal showed clearly enough that a big concentration of strength in the Pacific was in progress. Ordinary commercial traffic still went on. However, as the United States government, still hoping for peace, was careful to abstain from any action that might be interpreted as preparation for war. But special precautions were observed by the canal authorities during this period of crisis. All mercantile ships, American as well as foreign, having to undergo inspection before being permitted to enter the waterway. At dawn on March 3rd, a large Japanese cargo steamer, the Akashi Maru, owned by the Osaka Shosen Kaisha, arrived off Kolan, where she was boarded by an American guard boat. She proved to be from Hamburg to Kobe, with a consignment of heavy machinery and railroad material. Her papers were quite in order. Nothing of a suspicious nature was discovered by the inspecting party, and as no instructions had been received to hold up Japanese ships, it was decided to let the vessel pass through. The captain was told, however, that an armed guard would remain on board his ship while it was in the canal zone, and as he raised no objection to this, a party of 4 Marines, under a corporal, were detailed to accompany the Akashi Maru as far as Panama. The huge freighter, of nearly 12,000 tons dead weight, was worked through the first locks and entered Gatun Lake 8 miles astern of the American cruiser Huron, which had preceded her through the Gatun locks. Once out in the lake, she steamed at her full speed of 13 knots, making such good headway that at Bazo Bispo, where the channel enters the famous Culebra Cut, she had reduced the distance between herself and the cruiser to 5 miles. It has always been thought that she wished to involve the Huron in the catastrophe about to occur, but in this she failed, for the American warship escaped injury of any kind. The Akashi Maru was approximately midway in the cut when a thunderous explosion was heard, and a gigantic column of water, smoke, and dust shot up to the sky. Blending with the echoes of this terrific detonation was heard a roaring sound, of which the sinister import was but too well known to those familiar with the canal. The shock of the explosion had dislodged millions of tons of earth from the steep sides of the Culebra ravine, causing a landslide of infinitely greater dimensions than any that had been previously experienced. When a party of canal officials reached the scene of the disaster, an extraordinary spectacle met their gaze. A thick pall of dust still hung over the cut, both sides of which had collapsed for a distance of nearly 1,000 yards. Where a broad channel of water had existed half an hour before was now a solid rampart of earth 25 feet high. This, of course, was the bed of the canal, which had been forced up by the overwhelming pressure of the adjoining hills. Of the Japanese steamer that had caused the havoc, not a vestige remained. It seemed impossible that a great ship could be utterly blotted out in the space of a few seconds, yet so it was. Fragments of her structure were eventually picked up miles from the scene of the explosion, but the ship herself and all on board had vanished completely. It needed only a cursory glance to perceive the appalling extent of the damage. Landslides were of not infrequent occurrence in the cut, and special machinery was held ready to cope with them. But no such cataclysm as this had ever happened before. Months must elapse ere a channel could be cut through the mountainous debris, and meanwhile the canal would remain blocked at the very period when its use promised to be of vital importance to the United States. The mystery of the explosion which produced this fateful result has never been fully cleared up. The Japanese government disclaimed all knowledge of the cause, contenting itself with the suggestion that the oil fuel of the Akashi Maru might have caught fire and destroyed the ship, a theory dismissed by experts as too childish to be worth a moment's notice. In their opinion, nothing less than an immense quantity of high explosives could have caused so tremendous a detonation. One of their number attributed it to at least 1,000 tons of dynamite or blasting powder, and other estimates of the quantity of explosive were considerably higher. Inquiry into the movements of the Akashi Maru showed her to have arrived at Hamburg on January 15, 1931, from Kobe, with a mixed cargo, all of which was thought to have been discharged at the German port. She had then taken on board a full consignment of locomotives and heavy machinery, but there was no record of any explosives having been delivered to the ship at Hamburg. She sailed for Japan on February 5th, and had thus taken 26 days to cover the run of 5,000 miles to Kolan, an unusually long time for a ship with an economical speed of 10 knots. According to reports by other vessels on the route at approximately the same time, very little bad weather had been met with. The long duration of the Akashi Maru's voyage lent color to the theory that she had been met at sea by some ship which had transferred a large quantity of explosives to the big freighter. This view was generally accepted, though no plausible explanation was forthcoming as to how 1,000 tons of dynamite could have been stowed away without displacing cargo already in the hold, and in such a way as to remain hidden from the officials who had inspected the ship at Colon. The only other theory which in any way squared with the facts was that the explosives had been deposited on the bed of Culebra Cut by a Japanese steamer which had passed through several days, or even several weeks, previously, and that the Akashi Maru had detonated the charge by some prearranged method. But whether those on board had deliberately sacrificed themselves in their ship, or whether, owing to some miscalculation, the explosion had been premature, remains to this day an open question. Not only the Japanese government, but the owners of the ship and their agents both in Japan and Europe have consistently denied all knowledge of the facts or collusion in what was palpably a deep-laid plot for the blocking of the canal on the very eve of war. It is certain, at all events, that the United States government would have made this outrage a casus belli, even if Japan had refrained from committing other acts of hostility. From the American point of view, the disabling of the canal was a calamity of the first magnitude, which threatened to ruin all the plans on which the strategical employment of the Navy had been based. While the greater part of the fleet was already in the Pacific, a number of important ships were still in the other ocean and would now have to make a journey of 13,000 miles before reaching their war bases on the west coast. This, however, was by no means the most serious consequence of the disaster. For several months at least, it ruled out all the Atlantic coast navy yards as a factor of immediate value in the prosecution of the war. The entire fleet in the Pacific would have to depend on the resources of local yards for its maintenance, and these were notoriously ill-equipped to supply the needs of a great naval force. Until the canal was repaired, vast quantities of fuel, stores, and other war material required by the fleet must be shipped to the west coast via Cape Horn, a voyage of nearly 2 months for the average cargo steamer, since the railroads would be able to undertake but a relatively small part of this traffic. It was therefore of supreme importance to get the canal in working order again as quickly as possible. To excavate a passage sufficiently deep and wide for the largest ships would be a task of at least 4 months, according to the original forecast. Actually, owing to further landslides which seemed to mock at the superhuman efforts put forth by all concerned, the work was not finished for 6.5 months. But meanwhile, grave loss and disaster were to be suffered in consequence of the initial blow which Japan had delivered at her antagonist, as will appear in due course. An incident now occurred which, though trivial in itself, was destined to have far-reaching consequences on the naval campaign about to open. Following the news of the Culebra Cut explosion, all merchant ships in the canal, or awaiting admission at Balboa and Colon, were ordered to anchor under the guns of the coast batteries, pending a thorough search of each vessel, regardless of the flag it flew. There was a not unnatural suspicion that some further outrage might be contemplated for the purpose of intensifying the damage already caused to the canal. A rigid censorship was placed on all communications from the canal zone, and no message was allowed to be sent which made any reference to the disaster. The idea was to keep the news secret for a few days, not only for military reasons, but to enable all incoming ships to be held up and searched on the chance of finding another hidden cargo of explosives. It was, of course, probable that Japan had already taken measures to notify her shipping of the outbreak of war, in which case they would give the canal zone a wide berth. But, on the other hand, there was a bare possibility that some vessel, bent upon mischief, would enter the trap which had been set. As a further precaution, destroyers, submarines, and aircraft attached to the canal zone defenses were ordered to patrol the Atlantic and Pacific within a radius of 200 miles from Colon and Panama, respectively. Their mission was to keep a vigilant watch over the approaches to the canal, and if any vessel, finding itself under observation, sought to escape, to bring the suspect into port for examination. At 8 a.m. on March 5th, the United States submarine S-4, being then 150 miles north of Colon, sighted a large merchant steamer which displayed no colors. The vessel was steering due east and therefore heading away from the canal, but the fact that it altered course and appeared to increase speed on observing the submarine impressed Lieutenant Bradlow, commanding S4, as a suspicious circumstance. He therefore raised speed to 15 knots, and finding the steamer took no notice of his signal to heave to, fired a blank shot from the 4-inch gun mounted on the deck of the submarine. Neither this nor a second blank charge had any effect, while the thick smoke pouring from the funnels of the mysterious vessel showed that her captain did not mean to be caught if he could help it. What with the thick weather that limited visibility to a couple of miles, and the high speed at which the unknown ship was now steaming, Lieutenant Bradlow saw nothing for it but to take sterner measures if the chase were not to get clear away, and to permit that would have been contrary to his orders. So he caused a shell to be fired across the steamer's bows. It pitched into the water less than 100 yards ahead, but not the slightest attention was paid even to this peremptory summons. The mist was now so thick that the profile of the steamer could scarcely be made out. The submarine, though running at her best speed, could not overhaul the swift quarry, and the only way of compelling her to obey orders was to open fire in real earnest. This was done, but to avoid needless damage, the first 2 shells were unfused. The first round fell short, though near enough to send a shower of water over the steamer's forecastle. The second, flying high, tore away a boat and demolished part of the deckhouse. This proved to be enough, for the stranger promptly hove to, at the same time hoisting the Japanese flag. In response to a megaphone hail from the submarine, which had now come within speaking distance, the captain announced his ship to be the Nikko Maru of the Nippon Yusen Kaisha, with passengers and cargo from New York to Valparaiso and Yokohama. His ordinary route, he added, would have taken him through the canal, but having some hours previously intercepted a radio message which announced war between Japan and the United States to be imminent, he had decided to make for a Brazilian port to obtain instructions from his owners. He ended by protesting vehemently against the action of the submarine in firing into him, claiming to be well within his rights in trying to escape, as submarine attacks on merchant shipping were forbidden by international law. At this point, Lieutenant Bradlow broke off the parley by ordering the steamer to shape a course for Colon, and this was done under protest, the S4 following astern with her gun trained on the prize, the short voyage being accomplished without further incident. As soon as the Nikko Maru reached Colon, she was boarded and thoroughly searched, but nothing of a suspicious nature was found. Nevertheless, having been captured after war had broken out, she was held as lawful prize and eventually put into service as a United States Fleet auxiliary. On receiving a detailed report of the circumstances from Lieutenant Bradlow, through the officer commanding in the Canal Zone, the Navy Department officially approved his action. It was realized, however, that a dangerous precedent had been set, of which the enemy would not be slow to take advantage. Evidence of this was soon forthcoming in the shape of an official message from Tokyo, which announced to the world that since a United States submarine, in direct contravention of the Five-Power Treaty signed at Washington in 1922, had molested and fired on an unarmed Japanese merchant steamer, and since this illegal act on the part of the commander of the submarine had not been disavowed by the United States authorities, the Japanese government had no option but to regard the said treaty as null and void, and would, accordingly, reserve to itself the right to employ its own submarines in any way it saw fit. This led to much controversy among international jurists as to whether the action of S4 did, in fact, constitute a breach of the treaty regulating the procedure of submarines with regard to merchant vessels. The pertinent clauses of the treaty were as follows. 1. A merchant vessel must be ordered to submit to visit and search to determine its character before it can be seized. A merchant vessel must not be attacked unless it refused to submit to visit and search after warning or to proceed as directed after seizure. 2. The belligerent submarines are not under any circumstances exempt from the universal rules above stated. And if a submarine cannot capture a merchant vessel in conformity with these rules, the existing law of nations requires it to desist from attack and from seizure, and to permit the merchant vessel to proceed unmolested. The signatory powers recognized the practical impossibility of using submarines as commerce destroyers without violating, as they were violated in the recent War of 1914-18, the requirements universally accepted by civilized nations for the protection of the lives of neutrals and non-combatants, and to the end that the prohibition of the use of submarines as commerce destroyers shall be universally accepted as a part of the law of nations. They now accept that prohibition as henceforth binding as between themselves, and they invite all other nations to adhere thereto. It will be seen that the rules laid down as above were to some extent contradictory. On the one hand, a submarine was authorized by implication to detain, visit, and search a merchant vessel, and equally by implication to attack such a vessel if it refused to submit to visit and search. On the other hand, the submarine was expressly forbidden to persist with the attack if it seemed impossible to capture the merchant vessel without endangering the lives of non-combatants on board. Finally, the signatory powers, of whom the United States was one, had in the concluding paragraph virtually bound themselves not to employ submarines against merchant vessels under any circumstances whatever. It could be, and was argued on behalf of the United States, that the case of the S4 and the Nikomaru was an exceptional one. Only a few hours previously, a merchant vessel under the Japanese flag had been the means of inflicting serious damage on the Panama Canal. And while the Japanese government might deny complicity in this outrage, the fact remained that a merchantman, owned and manned by its nationals, had committed a flagrant act of war. It was but natural, therefore, that all other Japanese vessels in the vicinity of the canal should fall under grave suspicion and be regarded as active enemies until the contrary had been proved. For this reason, the United States held itself justified in taking the measures that had been taken against the Nikomaru, whose behavior when requested to stop and submit to search had been highly suspicious. That the ship had been intercepted by a submarine instead of a surface patrol vessel was a fortuitous circumstance that did not affect the main issue. The United States government concluded by maintaining that the treaty in question was still valid and would continue to be observed by its own submarines till further notice. The controversy thus initiated endured as long as the war itself, but Japan always insisted that the shots fired by S4 had automatically canceled the embargo on submarines as commerce destroyers, and from that time forward did not scruple to use her underwater boats for attacking enemy merchant ships. For the moment, however, public interest was centered on a matter of more immediate concern: the fate of those gallant men who were called upon to defend America's overseas possessions against crushing odds. From March 8th to March 7th, not a word of news reached Washington from that quarter of the world. It was as though an impenetrable screen had been established round a great area of the Western Pacific to hide the tragedy being enacted in those distant waters. Late on March 8th, the silence was broken by a press cable from Hong Kong to London, transmitted to New York. This stated that rumors were current in the Chinese ports of a great naval battle having been fought off the Philippines between the Japanese and American fleets and ending in the total destruction of the latter. A few hours later came another cable from the same source, containing news of the direst import. A Dutch steamer from Batavia to Hong Kong had reported by radio that she had picked up, 200 miles west of Manila, 7 survivors of the American destroyer Crosby, who had been found clinging to wreckage from their lost ship. Being in the last stage of exhaustion, they were unable to give coherent details of what had occurred, and could only say that their ship had been sunk, along with all the rest, in action with the whole Japanese fleet. Further particulars were promised in a later cable, but before this arrived, the dread news of disaster was confirmed by a brief but pregnant official bulletin from Tokyo, which is here quoted in full. In the forenoon of March 6th, our South Sea naval forces, under the command of Vice Admiral Hiraga, encountered the American Asiatic Squadron outside Manila Bay. By skillful maneuvers, it was brought to action under favorable conditions, the battle lasting 3 hours. The enemy force was totally destroyed, in spite of a brave defense. We sank 5 cruisers, 1 large auxiliary, 9 destroyers, and several submarines. 2 store ships were sunk and 1 was captured. A number of prisoners have been taken. Our losses are small. Operations in the southern seas are continuing to our advantage. Japanese war bulletins have never erred on the side of verbosity, but as a rule they are very much to the point. This one was no exception. It told in plain terms of the annihilation of the only American naval force in the Far East, and consequently, the only force which had been available for the floating defense of the Philippines. The islands, being thus deprived of all means of protection by naval power, were now exposed to the full force of Japanese attack. It is true that some resistance could be offered by the shore batteries and minefields, but that these could long withstand a determined onslaught by such forces as the enemy would be certain to bring against them, no one in Washington believed. Tragedies have often been foreseen before they actually occurred, but the feelings they evoke are nonetheless poignant on that account. The bad news from the Far East sent a wave of grief over the United States. For the time being, little heed was paid to the peril which menaced the Philippines. The country was thinking of those thousands of gallant seamen who had gone to their doom, fighting to the last against tremendous odds, with the old flag still flying as the waters closed above the torn and battered hulls of their ships. But the first thrill of horror was succeeded by a stern resolve to see this struggle through to the bitter end. However protracted the war might be, however costly in blood and treasure, it would be waged with the combined might of the whole nation until the sword was struck from the enemy's grasp and he was forced to sue for peace. And it was in that spirit that the American people waited for further details of the tragedy of Manila, which to them, if not to their leaders, had come like a bolt from the blue.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.